Welcome to this interview with George Marshall. I'm your host, Dan Miller. George Marshall is a climate communications expert and is the founding director of Climate Outreach, an organization that works on improving climate communications around the world. He is also the author of Don't Even Think About It: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. This interview is part of a series of interviews with climate scientists, technologists, authors, advocates, communicators, and others involved in understanding and fighting climate change. It is sponsored by the Climate Chat Club on the social platform Clubhouse. If you are a member of Clubhouse, please join our club. And now, our interview with George Marshall.
And now I'd like to welcome George Marshall to the stage. And George, I've known for a long time. Well, I've known of George for a really long time because I found his information sort of by accident. It was about climate psychology, and I thought it was really cool. I incorporated that into my talk, and then I found a really old talk of George's, and I recommend this to everyone. It's so old that on YouTube, you couldn't have like more than 10 minutes at a time back then on YouTube. And so it's broken up, I think, into 3 sections. George, maybe you can correct me. But if you search for George Marshall, and it's called The Ingenious Ways We Avoid Believing in Climate Change. I still think watched many times in the past. And that's how I got to know George a little bit more. And then we started communicating, and I encouraged him to write a book. And he did. And that book is called Don't Even Think About It: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. That's one of the subjects we're going to talk about. And I will just say that I think it's one of the best books on climate change that's actually not about climate change. It's about us and how we think, how we communicate. And it's actually a lot of fun, unlike most climate change books that are kind of depressing. It's a lot of fun and a great book. And George, welcome to the stage.
Oh, thanks so much, Dan. Thank you. Nice to be with you.
So to start off, I think it's helpful for everyone just to understand your background and how what you're doing now in terms of climate outreach. So how did let's take it back a bit. You know, what did you do long ago, and how did that lead to where you are today?
I'm proud to be an environmentalist, and I'm saying that because I think in our conversation it might come back to my deep criticisms of environmentalists. But I am one, and I've worked all over the block. I mean, I was head of the forest campaign for Greenpeace in the U.S., based out of Washington D.C. I've lived for many years in the U.S. I've worked all around the world. I did a lot of work supporting indigenous rights, and I was originally working on forests, I think around the year 2000, well, slightly before that. A lot of very nasty new research started coming out, particularly out of a Hadley Centre in the UK, pointing out the impacts that climate change would have, and sadly, we can see now is already having, on the very areas of forest that I was fighting to try and protect. And I decided, I made a pledge in the year 2000 that I would work on climate change for the rest of my life, which actually felt kind of liberating. Like, to say you're just going to do one thing for the rest of your life is great, because we have so much choice. And anyway, it means you're not going to do anything wrong, right? So, if you make a mistake, that's fine. That's just learning for the next phase. And I started doing a lot of public speaking, a lot of talking, a lot of activism. I'm a strong believer in protest as well, and protest movements. And I was just endlessly frustrated by how hard it was to get anyone's attention around the year 2000. And it was hardly a new issue then. It had been chugging along for well over a decade, even longer, depending on how far back you go. And but I just couldn't get people's attention. And I guess that's what started getting me thinking, first of all, that we were really, really doing a bad job of communicating with people and engaging them. But also, secondly, to ask if there was something fundamentally about this issue that made it hard for people to get their heads around it. And, now the level of public awareness and public involvement is very, very high. And so, whether people accept it or don't accept it, but it's easy to forget that back in 2000, in the 90s, the majority of people really gave no thought to climate change from one year to the next. So about 17 years ago, I started a new organization called Climate Outreach. And we are the European leaders, and in fact, kind of one of the global leaders in this issue of how do we talk about climate change. Specifically, how do we talk to the people who don't believe in it? And I have a TEDx talk up on YouTube that people on the call might be interested in, called why I like listening to the people I disagree with. Because part of the thing when I was writing the book was it gave me the chance to go and really spend some time talking to people who didn't believe in climate change and listening to them with interest and respect, wanting to hear their views and realizing that something had gone seriously wrong with the way we talk about it.
Well, speaking of that, those in the room who watch my TEDx talk, the actual center part of that talk talks about the psychology of climate change, and that stuff actually came directly from you. That's how I sort of first found you. I found some slides or something that you had put out on threat indicators, and I compare the situation to being on the savannah and a lion approaches you, and what's that versus climate change? And the threat indicators were things that are immediate, visible, historical precedent, simple causality, direct personal consequences, and caused by an enemy, which is a very important one. And back when I gave this TED Talk in 2014, it was still very relevant because essentially, climate change still triggered like zero of those threat indicators for the most part, unless you were really focused on it, a special person. So what's your feeling? I'm getting the feeling that things are changing, especially the last year or two. Do you think that we're starting to trigger some of those threat indicators?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the big change that we're seeing all around the world is a change. Well, first of all, it's a change of levels of concern. They're continuing to go up and up, but we shouldn't be complacent about that. They have a long way to go, I think, before we're really fully on board. But I think people's perception of whether climate change is happening now really is changing. We know that from the figures that come out of Yale University surveys in the US. I've seen it in Canada, certainly across Europe. Again, we always have to be careful with attitude research because it's very, very unequal. It's very biased towards the richer countries. I suspect if you go to the poorer countries, they've been saying this much, much longer. That it used to be that people would say climate change, that sounds like a serious problem for some long time in the future. And it was one of these psychological factors that distanced people from it. They would distance it geographically and temporally. They'd say, first of all, it's a long time in the future, and secondly, it's going to affect someone else somewhere else. And as you know, Dan, one of the things I really lay into in the book is this kind of iconography of having this polar bear sitting on an ice sheet as the core iconography of climate change. It's like an issue where we need to make it here, now, and us is represented by different species a long way away. But
Right.
what is interesting and what's changed is actually that people increasingly are saying, yes, it's happening now. They're still reluctant to think it's going to affect them, though. If you ask them, is it going to affect you or your children? Most people say no. Or they don't think it's going to affect them much, put it that way. But this stuff is stepping up. The problem, of course, we have is that we're up against time. So there's no question whatsoever that at this rate, everybody is going to be at a level where they're going to be fully supporting a massive level of activity in 30 years. But we don't have 30 years, and that's the challenge.
Or less than that, yes. Yeah. Okay. But I am detecting this change. I guess you are too, and others are. And it really does seem to be. I mean, I guess everyone's hoping that we're approaching a tipping point on public engagement, that it's happening sooner rather than 30 years. Because you're right. Waiting even 10 years, it's going to be too late.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we know about public attitudes and engagement, but also this goes back to the psychology, is that there are positive and negative feedbacks, just as there are with physical geography, with climate change. The negative feedback is if you're in a group and where you think most of the people around you don't believe in climate change or don't think it's a problem, if you read an article and you believe in the science and you say, hell, this is a problem, you suppress your own views because the people around you in the group, you don't want to oppose them. You don't want to seem like like some kind of hippie eco freak who's going to be judged by them. And so you can get into this problem where actually quite a few people around you are concerned, but no one is saying it, so the problem doesn't exist. And that's the kind of negative feedback. And I'm sure that still happens a great deal in in kind of hardcore conservative constituencies in the US and in other countries.
Mm-hmm.
That's the negative feedback. Then the positive feedback is the reverse. The positive feedback is if the people around you are starting to talk about it, it becomes real to you and it allows you the space to talk about it and things, then you can actually get quite a rapid change, quite a rapid shift. I mean, the first step is that people have to talk about it because, again, as I talk about in the book, climate change is an abstract issue. It seems far away. It's hard for us to get our heads around. So it only really exists for us as a social construction. Sure, I mean, we get the heat waves and we get the climate extremes, but to understand it as climate change, it's got to be something that has a social meaning to us in our peer group. So I think we might have reached that tipping point where now enough people around enough people are talking about it. The problem is that there's a tipping point the other way, which is that if you really don't believe in this and if you think that it's part of a political worldview you disagree with, that can become amplified as well. And I must say, in the US in particular, the good news is that there's been a political shift with one party, but there hasn't been a shift in the polarization. The US is just as polarized as it's been all along. There's a bit more shift towards Republican support on climate change, but crikey, the situation is polarized at the moment, more than any country in the world, actually.
And we're going to talk about some of your current work.
Try and shift that. If you're someone from the left and you're stepping into this and you're trying to shift it, what you do is you don't shift it at all. You actually amplify it.
So we're going to talk a little bit about what the governments can do in that regard a little bit later. But there's so much in your book. I was looking through it again and trying to figure out what to ask you about. And so I do recommend everyone read it. The chapters are very short and there are lots of them and very interesting stuff. But talk about one thing that kind of
people pick it up and flip through it and they say, "Wow, it's great." The chapters are 4 pages long.
That's right. So you can feel like you made a lot of progress as you read through it. But one of the things that hit me over the head.
It's hard to write 4-page chapters. Sorry, Dan, you go.
Yeah, one of the things that hit me over the head when I read the book is you went out for this book. You went out and you interviewed lots of people in all different situations. And you interviewed people that had just been hit by a climate change catastrophe, Hurricane Sandy. And then you asked the question, or I asked the question to people and see what they would say. Are you more, after you get hit by a climate change catastrophe, and you know it's a climate change catastrophe, are you more or less willing to talk about climate change? Can you talk a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed people up and down the coast of New Jersey. I went to Bastrop in Texas, which had huge firestorms, like massive fires. There's no question both of these events have a climate change component. I mean, they're off the scale serious events, and there's a strong scientific consensus behind that. But I've done similar things, incidentally, in places in Europe. We've had here in my country, in Britain, we've had extreme flooding across Britain. As we know, the thing with climate change, it tends to get you what you already get, but more of it. And that's why it's one of the reasons why people avoid thinking about climate change, because if you have something that is just more of whatever you already expect to happen, it doesn't feel like a massive shock. It feels like a step up in this thing that you're already expecting, and in some degrees that you're adapted to. So there's a whole lot of adaptation responses that kick in when you experience that. If you get a massive heat wave in a country that's already hot, it's horrible, but it's something to some degree already prepared for. So I did these anyway. I did these interviews, and people were very, very happy to talk to me at great length about how strong their sense of community was and how their neighbors had cared for them. And then I said, well, tell me about the last conversation you had about climate change. And I did a lot of interviews up and down in both these places, and not a single person could tell me about the last conversation they'd had about climate change, never mind if they'd even had one. Um, and this was very interesting. I said, why aren't you talking about this? And they said, well, why would we be talking about this? And I said, well, maybe it's got something to do with what's just happened to you. And they said, well, why would we be talking about this? We're trying to recover. We're stepping forward. We're rebuilding. And I realized that what happens is that people, after a major extreme event like that, but they go into a coping mechanism, which is a recovery mechanism. It's about rebuilding, it's about renewing, it's about restoring. Their community is very strong. They don't want an issue with that might be polarizing. Interestingly, in New Jersey, people were quite explicit about this. They were saying, I've been a Democrat all my life, and this is the first time I've really been close to my Republican neighbors. I'm not going to jeopardize that. So that was kind of interesting. But also, who the hell, if you've just been hit by Hurricane Sandy, who the hell wants to be thinking that there might be another one of these coming down the line? The narrative that you want to hold on to is the one that this was a completely freak 1 in 100 year event and that you're never going to see another one. So there's a lot of things pitched up there. There's a kind of familiarity. There's the recovery mode. There's the desire not to see a repetition. And remember, everything goes through this lens of this publicly shaped narrative, what people talk about and what they don't talk about. Because clearly, as soon as I mentioned the subject of climate change, the conversation shut down very rapidly with these people. So conversations get shut down, and this is an issue. I mean, I mean, I've just been researching in Australia the extent to which the massive bushfires that they had across Australia shifted attitudes on climate change was surprisingly little. They made the people who were already very concerned about climate change more concerned. But the people who weren't that concerned about climate change didn't shift. We've seen similar things in research in the states of extreme weather events. And I guess it's interesting. It's how humans are. We're extremely adaptive. Of course, the worry is that every time you have an extreme weather event, it also sets a benchmark that then the next event has to be worse than that before you register it. And that is especially bad for this constantly incrementally creeping temperature rise. So if you have an extreme jump in temperature, or if you live in Alaska and suddenly, all your telegraph poles are falling over because the permafrost is melting, or you have wildfires running through Siberia, of course, then that triggers maybe a level of awareness. But if you just have a situation where each year it just creeps up by a fraction of a degree, I mean, all over Britain where I am now, like everything, all of the plants and the flowers are coming out early. But we're remembering it in terms of last year or the year before.
That's right.
I think, I think what this shows me is that, again, everything is seen through the lens of the publicly shaped narrative of what's happening and whether it's important. And it's absolutely essential we get people within their communities talking about climate change, how this is climate change. And with the more conservative communities, we start talking with them about climate change before the extreme event, not after. If you talk about it after, it feels very exploitative. It's like talking about gun control after Sandy Hook, right? People just say that people have died, don't talk about it. But when do you talk about it? And the answer is, well, you wait for things to die down, you leave them a little bit, and then you start a conversation which isn't about climate change, it's about preparation. And you say, look, that nasty storm we had, about flooding, that heat wave. That showed what a great community we have, how we love each other, how we support each other. We can feel really proud of that. So you ground your narrative in a reinforcement of sense of people's pride in their identity. And then you say, well, there's going to be more of that coming down the line. So let's start a conversation now where we can get the best information we can about what's going to happen, and we can prepare so we can protect and defend ourselves. And then you've got a position for a conversation.
Australia is really troubling because it's sort of the poster child for climate change. We're getting to watch what climate change looks like a little bit ahead of time by seeing there are massive floods, like things never seen before, the dying of the coral reefs, the incredibly massive fires, and having to add new colors to the weather map to handle higher temperatures than have ever been seen before. Okay, so you have all that, and as you're saying, it's not moving public. In fact, they still have this conservative government that still wants to build more coal plants and stuff. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, Dan,
Gee.
it is moving public opinion. It would be wrong for me to say it's not, but it's not moving fast enough. And
Okay.
it's certainly not moving fast enough to send the conservative politicians, confusingly in Australia they're called the Liberal Party, but the conservative politicians, a message that they are going to, but action on climate change is going to win them votes, compared with the fact that it's going to lose them support from the coal industry. So the politicians are juggling these two things, and they're not getting a very clear signal on it. And of course, part of the reason for that is also because the people who are concerned are suppressing their views, and we know that very, very well from the research they've done in Australia. Again, it's that vicious circle coming in.
So other things in your book, there's again so many. The other thing I really felt was important is you talked about what you learned from religious groups about how to communicate about climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, to begin with, Dan, I was interested in the separation between religion and science. It's kind of interesting when you say to, I mean, colloquially, when we're talking about it, we might say, I believe climate change is a problem. But actually, when you bring in this word believe or belief, climate scientists are in utter horror. And they'll say it's not a matter of belief. Well, I'm a social scientist, I'm a social anthropologist by background. And actually, I think belief is really important because I think belief is the means by which, in a social context, we come to hold and shape our views. I'm not a climate scientist. I believe in climate change because I trust climate scientists and because I'm part of a social group that thinks climate change is really serious and accepts it. So I was interested in this wider area of belief and whether there were things that could be learnt from faiths which struggle with things which are a lot harder to accept than climate change. And whether you are a person of faith yourself or whether you believe or don't believe or whatever, you have to recognize that there's some very, very interesting things to learn there. Also, as somebody who's worked all of my life with social movements, I was very interested in how faith groups organize social movements. I mean, they're the largest and fastest growing social movements in the world. So I did ask some questions on that, and I think there was a lot there that could be learnt. And I think I put some of the lessons from there in the book. I actually interviewed some evangelical preachers on this. And I'm very interested, by the way, in evangelicals also as a group who are extremely under-engaged around climate change. As a little aside, there are all of these groups in society who are fantastically active and involved with immense potential that environmental organizations don't talk to. And I think, generally speaking, conservatives as a whole, but I also think people of faith very much. So yeah. So what we can learn from that, I think, is first of all that faith is a wonderful lens through which to see the world. Secondly, that we could and should be engaging with people of faith on a much larger scale, and I'd say particularly Muslims in regards to this. And I've done a lot of work with Muslims who have a lot of very strong reasons, both through their faith but also through their geography. World's Muslims live in part, maybe from the Indonesians living in places that are in the highest impact areas on the planet. And also generally in terms of social organizing, how do you go out there and how do you engage with people? You don't just whack them over the head with a report. You go out there and well, I remember I went to hear Billy Graham's preach. He did one of his kind of gospel tours in the UK. And it's very interesting to me, when he did his preaching, when he said, now stand up, make a decisive change in your life, step forward is what they call the altar call. Step forward and receive a blessing and make a change now. And it was just so interesting to me that we never do that with climate change. We just assume that the information, by some kind of osmosis, it just kind of like floats into our heads. We don't realize that actually the way that people's lives change is they make a choice. They take something on board. It's hard. It's difficult. That's another thing, by the way, is we never talk about climate change and thinking about it and caring about it as being um, painful or difficult or upsetting or,
Hmm.
I mean, we do a little bit, but I mean, we try to avoid that. Well, no, let's talk about it as that. And let's say this is hard and this is difficult, but come and join us. Oh, it's also, by the way, very important. Good evangelists are full of the joy of their faith. I mean, that's why people might want to be a part of it. And I think in the environmental movement, we're so full of the misery of what we work on. Why is somebody? We are all advertisements for the cause we work for, and when I speak about it, I always talk about the joy of my work and how valuable it's been in my life and the amazing people I've worked with. Because in the end, it's if people want to do what I do, it's not going to be about the climate change. It's going to be about whether this seems like a really fun thing to do. Um,
That's right. I agree
you
with
know,
that, by the
but
way.
yeah,
And
I think there's a lot
and
to learn there. And again, I go back to the point again, which is a constant theme of what I say as well. And what I try and bring into the book is I try and say, look, there are huge, huge worlds of people out there who have been scarcely been engaged in this issue, who have so much to give. And the language I keep coming back to is a language of contribution. Everybody has something to contribute to this issue, and we have to find a way of talking about it, which is embracing and saying, you know what, you and I might disagree about so many things, but you've got something really important to offer, and I can learn from you. And this is also what pains me in the sort of politically polarized environment, especially in the States. For both sides just shout at each other and they don't open up the possibility that maybe there might be something in common that they share that they could learn from each other. That everybody has something to contribute.
so, George, you mentioned don't hit them with a report. So I have
Yeah.
in my I have a quote from your book that I use often, which speaking of like hitting people with data, it says you wrote, ironically, one of the best proofs that information does not change people's attitudes is that science communicators continue to ignore the extensive research evidence that shows that information does not change people's attitudes. So I find it useful to pull that quote out. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah. It's yeah, yeah. Scientists are like anybody. I mean, obviously, there's a regimen and there's a kind of an intellectual discipline to science, but it's also a culture. And scientists occupy a culture where they believe that information exists in a certain way and they talk in a certain way. And sadly, yes, they lose sight of the fact that maybe that doesn't work for people. We did Climate Outreach did a bunch of work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I think we're one of the very few external communications advisors to them, and we're advising them on how better to communicate the science. And we're giving them good advice and so on about how to tell a story and how to speak to people's values. This keeps coming back again and again in our work. But what we also say to them is we say, look, climate change is a science, that's very important, and communications is a science, and there's a very large body of communications research, and as I bring into the book, a large body also of kind of like social psychology research that shows that there are some ways that work and there's some ways that don't work. And um, our attitudes to climate change are in the end socially formed, and that is the way that we have to reach it. And I'd also say on that point, we haven't said it yet, I really want to emphasize it though, that people's responses are very much a product of their identity, and especially the insecurity of their identity. And so if that is what's going on for people, if people are finding it hard to accept or come to terms with the issue because of who they are, we have to find a better way of speaking to who they are. And so much of what we're doing is we're saying, hey, what you are is crap, actually. What you are is not worthwhile. It's not important. You should be like us because we're the good guys. And we're kind of surprised that doesn't work. So I think again, it's that identity. Now, of course, if I'm speaking to scientists, when I want to speak to their identity, I want to speak to how important they are and how proud I am of what they do, and what they do is important. It's the same for any group.
Hmm. Um, well, speaking of messaging about one of the chapters in your book is uh, why, let's see, how climate change became your fault.
Hmm.
And there's some recent news about Exxon targeting their PR campaigns to talk only about like personal energy use, and that's the cause of climate change
Uh,
rather than the fact that they make fossil fuels. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of your book?
yeah, I mean, there was a. I mean, when I was writing the book, it was still stronger in people's minds, but there was a whole spate of activities around the kind of first 10 years of this century, that was about 10 easy things you could do to save the planet, and there was a lot of stuff in the media, but there was actually entire governments back this. I mean, the Canadian
And you wrote
government.
a book on this too, by the way, right?
I did. I wrote a book
I
called
read it.
Carbon Detox, which is. Oh, did you? Oh, I'm flattered to hear that. Yeah, I mean, it was a kind of a carbon counter thing, saying what you do. I mean, look, it is very important that people take personal action. It is very, very important, and it's the fact of climate change is it's always going to be one of those all the above. We need personal action. We need businesses. We need governments. We need, again, it's that contribution. Everybody has something to contribute, which is important to this. But where the lines of responsibility lie get blurred, and they get blurred because yes, the governments were very interested in making it a personal responsibility issue because that seemed to be not political. Like to say it's the fault of fossil fuel companies, that's labeled as political, but to say, hey, here's some things you can do in your own life, that's not. But of course, everything's political, and that is highly political because the idea that change should be done through personal choice is a very libertarian idea, actually, and there's a political basis to it. But governments are not going to make you do things, but you're going to be gently encouraged to do it. It doesn't. I mean, there's some sense in it sometimes. It doesn't seem to work very well. And actually, these big programs these governments ran were complete failures, abject failures. None of them achieved anything. Canada did one, Britain did one, Australia did one, Ireland did one. Incidentally, Canada and Ireland and Australia were all countries that have really, really failed to meet their climate obligations. But we've got to find the right balance too, because a lot of the work which has been coming out now for 1.5 degrees reiterates the role for personal change. What we know, though, is that people need to make that change because it's part of their identity. It goes back to identity again. If we try and blame people, or if we try and say it's your fault, so you have to give things up, then not surprisingly, people tell us where to go. But if it's a conversation about how this is something which is really important to you, whatever your identity is, this is about being a proud American, or this is being about a member of your community, or this is about being about following the Hadith or the Quran, or whatever the language is. But we need to find a way that the personal action feels like who people are. Otherwise, you get into this whole diffused responsibility thing where someone says, "Well, I'm not going to do it unless somebody else does it," and then we're just endlessly trapped. I guess, yeah. And the final thing, of course, about it's your fault is this thing you flagged up earlier, Dan, about this idea of the enemy. Climate change is a narrative without an enemy. It isn't caused by North Korea or by the communists or by or by the neo-Nazis or anybody who might be an identifiable enemy. It's caused by us, often doing things. Well, nobody has any intention to cause it. Donald Trump didn't intend to cause climate change. Exxon didn't intend to cause climate change, even if they contributed. And often it's things done out of love. It's like, flying to, flying to see your mother, or it's putting food on the table. It's feeding you. I'm probably, I sometimes feed my son beef burgers. I do it out of love. I mean, it's not good for the climate, but I love him. I want to show love. So the problem then becomes that it's very open to enemies, and therefore this thing of saying it's your fault. We have to be very careful about that language, because we need to, when you have a vacuum, things move in to fill it. And it's your fault can be, it's your fault, you environmental extremists, it's your fault, you disgusting oil corporations, it's your fault, you rich people, or you poor people having too many babies, or whatever the narrative is. And of course, again, we go back to this idea of contribution. It's like it's everybody's problem, and we all contribute something useful to it, and we all contribute to the problem. So we're all in it together.
Hmm. Yeah, so I got so much more to ask you, but I'm going to ask you just one more thing so we can get to the audience questions. So your recent work is focused on getting governments to educate the public about climate change. Can you tell us about that and why it's important?
Yeah, we've got a climate outreach, got a generous grant from a major foundation. We're going to take the whole thing up a level. Back in the Framework Convention back in 1992, and then repeated in the Paris Agreement, every government in the world committed to communicating with their citizens. They were going to inform, educate them. They were going to enable them to participate in climate policy. It's there in Article 6, and then in Paris in Article 10. In Paris in Article 11, they said that they were going to help provide funding for less developed countries to inform and educate their citizens. Absolutely nothing has happened. I mean, there's scattered things here and there. Some governments have tried to do things. I don't know of a single government which has a sustained policy of raising public awareness on climate change. And so, the reason we have to do this is because if say, in a polarized situation like the US or Australia, governments since 1992 had just steadily been investing in building public awareness along the lines I suggest, like speaking to all groups, saying they all have something to contribute, speaking to their values, I can guarantee we wouldn't have the polarization we have now. But they backed off from that commitment. And I think if COVID shows us anything, and again, with the kind of arguments we're having around COVID and vaccination and so on, is merely a reiteration of the same sort of like culture wars that we have around these other issues. But if COVID has shown us anything, it's like you've got to invest in informing people about what's going on, why they should do it, treating them with intelligence, and saying these issues are important. And the goal is to make governments damn well stand up and do it. It's going to be a long time. It's going to be a long time struggle. It's far, far too late. But got the big climate negotiations happening in Britain. We're talking as much as we can with the British government. I really want governments to understand, again, maybe building on the COVID experience, that they cannot hope to achieve these major targets if they don't get a mandate, a well-informed mandate from all citizens, not just their party voters, but everybody has to be on board with this. And you don't get that overnight. You earn that. You earn it through hard work, and you've got to stump up some cash. If this was terrorism, or if this was smoking causes cancer, or if this was wear a seatbelt, or if it was anything, there would be a regular, sustained program to build awareness.
It's kind of amazing that there isn't, actually. When you mentioned this to me the other day, it's just like, wow. It's actually incredible to realize there's such a big gap in that it's actually such an important thing that's not happening, because the governments are going to have to ask you to do really big things, big important things like they did in COVID, and
they're going to ask us to do huge things. I don't
huge
think anybody other than people like ourselves, maybe some people on the call who work on this issue, have a clue about how big this is. I don't think the politicians do. I think when they come forward and they say we're going to, we're going to be carbon neutral, net zero by this year, I don't think they've given any thought to what that actually
That's right.
really means for them politically. And in the past few years, since I wrote the book, I've been advising governments through the World Bank. We've been working closely with the World Bank on how to communicate carbon tax. And, it's a carbon tax is a disaster. I mean, you've had real problems getting it through in Washington State. You've got a trading system there in California, but in Australia they tried to get something very mild through, and it brought the government down. Similarly, the French government almost collapsed when they tried to bring in a carbon price.
But
And this, and
that's why
even lower.
I propose giving all the money back to the public and the fee and dividend,
Yeah.
and that one, yeah.
Well, that would be nice. I mean, that might
Yes.
work too. It's true, because that is a policy that starts from the very outset of thinking, how can we have a policy that might build that mandate? And that's what we say to governments. We say, look, don't get economists to design your policy. Get communications
That's exactly
people
right.
to tell you what they think is going to work. Because
Absolutely, by the way, and that's a point I've been trying to make for like 10 years or 15 years, and it's really hard to get that point across, that these policies are designed by policy wonks who want to optimize this, that, or the other thing, and like cap and trade is like this optimized thing that doesn't work at all, because well, it works a tiny bit, but not much compared to what it could be if they just thought from the beginning, how do we make a policy that the public will actually want and we'll engage on. Anyway,
right.
I've asked you so many questions. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, one of the things on exactly that point, is people's biggest, we just actually, I was just off a call just before speaking with you, with government of Pakistan, and we're talking about whether and how we can be talking about climate change in regards to air pollution, because although the level of public concern is high around climate change, it's not something, again, because people haven't been that well informed. It's not something that people have a clear sense of what it is and how it's formed. Very few people, and this includes people in educated contexts in our own countries, really understand the connection between climate change and burning fossil fuels. And that means we've got a huge gap in the narrative of this thing of saying, well, we need to get out of burning oil, coal, and gas. We need to be moving forward into renewables. People don't understand that that's part and parcel of climate change, and that is a problem. But they do understand air quality, and air quality is one of those gateway issues. We can start up a conversation. Now, if we're talking about carbon pricing, that's what we would say. Is we'd say to governments, well, you know what, maybe you should concentrate your policy on things that improve air quality. And
make polluters pay.
The policy wonks go, well, that's not the most efficient carbon tax. And so, well, carbon pricing, and go, well, I'm not interested. It's the one that people understand and might support.
Yeah, and then we actually had David Fenton on, who it was actually our first interview, and he mentioned simplifying the language, call it pollution, don't call it carbon this or carbon that. And so you're reiterating that as well. Let's move to questions. And Stacy, do you have a question for George? You get the first one.
I do, Dan. And George, I have been sitting here and I first want to say, Dan, I'm now on board with your fee and dividend from after this conversation. It's like, okay, yes, what will it take to get people on board with this? The thing that I've been struggling with, and when you were talking earlier about it was this very compassionate and all people have something to offer. I'm guessing you were talking about getting people on board to support this. And the thing that I've come to lately is if I'm talking to regular people, like peers, like individuals like me, that having as much compassion as possible is necessary. And it's also, we all are just living a function of how we've been brought up and the way the society is built around us, the policies that have been in place forever. But when it comes to talking with elected officials, agencies who have the power to make policy changes, to allocate budgets so that we might do things in a more sustainable way, and they consistently fail and fail and fail again, it is very hard for me to have any compassion, even if that poor person just got elected, because you now hold the mantle. And I know screaming doesn't work, but it's like we are burning the planet. I'm sitting here in San Francisco, and I just read how, we've had 900 fires
Yeah.
already. And I mean, I've heard about some of them and I know it's happening, but it's like our fire season didn't used to start until like October, and it's May. And
Yeah.
I'm just I'm I know we're out of time. And I in San Francisco, our government declared a climate emergency 2 years ago, and they have made no change to the
Yeah.
things that would make a difference. And so if in a place like San Francisco that's supposed to be all crunchy, educated, enlightened, forward thinking, etc., they can think to declare it, but then do nothing, that
Mm.
doesn't seem like an
So first,
emergency.
would
So
you have
how
there's a
do
question?
we how do we um, maintain the calm, or how do we get them to act? Because I think the ones that know and do nothing are almost worse than the ones who, are doing it out of profit and just ignore. So any help you
Yeah.
can give there to put my mind straight would
Yeah. I don't.
would be
I.
appreciated.
I don't want to. I don't want to say we shouldn't shout. I guess the question is, for me, the question for me as an activist, which I am in many ways, is where's my energy best put? But it doesn't mean that my overall theory of change doesn't have a big section for shouting. Um, because I think, I think that not only should people shout because they're angry, but also we know that shouting can, of not shouting, like being very, very clear and focused and emotional of what one means, can in certain situations be very effective. The question is where, and the question is whether it is balanced. And this is the big thing for me, is that it needs. I mean, I've been involved with a lot of campaigns that have succeeded or failed. The ones that succeed are the ones where there is a spread of activity across the spectrum, where you've got people who are, chaining themselves for gates and pushing very hard. You've got the people who are in the middle who are making a policy case, and then you've got people on the inside who share the politics and the worldview of the people who you're approaching, and they're saying, you know what, there's a point in this. And I think you've got to have all three of those in place, ideally working together. And that sometimes there's a little bit of a magic to that. But one of the things that I always do in my campaigns is I always reach out to all of the people and just say, let's talk together. And I managed to shift Britain's largest DIY retailer to shift the timber that they sold, and I started a whole discussion with someone on the board who actually said, yeah, I agree with you. Now, can you go outside and do demonstrations? And then I can go to the board and say, look what's happening outside our gates. So I think it's a two-pronged approach that works.
But
Yeah.
so that's why did he need that cover? Why did he need that cover to make the change? Why couldn't he say, you know what, I've learned something that I wasn't aware of, and gosh, this makes sense. Like, I'm so proud that we as an organization now have this knowledge and are going to shift and do the thing that's right. Why
because
do
everybody requires cover. Like they say, cover, like they say, when you're in a, and you're in a. I've only ever seen this in war films, but like you're running forward and you say, "Give me cover," and there's somebody like, does stuff behind you to give you the space to go and do it. I think we all need cover. I happen to be, and maybe you are as well, living in a world that allows me a lot of space to do these kind of things and to say, I really care about that. And I don't work. I'm not on the board of a huge DIY retailer, nor could I be. They wouldn't touch me. I mean, the fact is that the people who get into that position have gotten there because they have followed the party line. The bigger the organization, the stronger the pressure to conform, and the greater the penalties for stepping out of line. And so I think we just need to recognize that and not necessarily to blame people for the limits for what they can do, but to recognize there's good guys and bad guys, and we try and work with the good guys, and when we have an opportunity, we try and open it up. Um, and again, when things happen, the shift that happens is very hard to predict or even to explain. Sometimes something gets the attention of someone high up, what's interesting is it's often about legacy. It's not in the end about the case. The case is the cover. So like the economic case or the arguments and so on, that's the cover. But what is important is the legacy, is people just saying, you know what, I'm going to make this change because in the end it's important for me, and in the end the thing which makes me proud is what I leave behind me. So, and there are people like that, you know. I mean, the whole businesses which shift ground. There's whole governments which shift ground. It's interesting in my observation in a political context, the time that environmental policy tends to stick is when it's created by conservatives, because the conservatives then keep it, and then the people on the left keep it. And that's, for example, most effective carbon tax in the world is the one in British Columbia in Canada. I think it was the first one, which was created by a conservative. So it's one of the reasons why I spend a lot of my time speaking with conservatives.
Great. By the way, so everyone, please keep your questions short because George has limited time.
Oh yeah,
so,
no, and I'll keep my answers short. Let me keep my answers short so we can get.
Well, no, you can talk as long as you want.
If we have a bunch of questions, Dan. Yeah, I know, but I can go a little over time. If we have a bunch of questions, let's rattle through them.
Okay, good. Albert, you're up. Thanks, Albert. Welcome to the stage.
Hey, yeah, I was thinking actually when you were talking about the Hurricane Sandy situation, I remember watching Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Interviewing a man on the street after that. She was out in Far Rockaway or something, and here's a guy picking up the rubble of his house in the street. And he's like been devastated. And she asked him, well, do you think this will make you have any lifestyle changes because of climate change? And he said, I'm not going to go there. And yeah, so I think, even a heavy impact on someone's life like that, wildfires in Australia, drought in California, it's not actually moving the needle that much. And that people really need a narrative, a story of something to look forward to, something they could actually do that would make things better, that their lives would be improved if they followed this new storyline. It's not really the disaster story that motivates people, is at least what I'm seeing.
Yeah, no, I think that's so right. I don't think, well, there's a lot of, in this world, as I said, this large body of peer-reviewed science around this. We know that disaster stories work well for people who have an identity that is already built around environmental disaster. Like me, works well for me. I hear about how something, if someone comes to me and says, this thing you thought was bad was even worse than you thought, I go, oh, right, well, I better take that on board. But I'm very unusual. And actually, as I say, I say to most of my friends in the environmental movement, it's like we're freaks. I mean, professional environmentalists are very, very unusual. And therefore, we cannot and should never allow ourselves to be the steer for what we think works or doesn't work with other people, because the set of circumstances have brought us to where we are. But like when Amy Goodman's saying that to someone in the street, of course he's going to say that. She's saying, are you now prepared to take on board the entire package, which is climate change is caused by personal lifestyles and personal emissions, and therefore you have a responsibility for destroying your own house. Why is somebody going to take that on board? I think, to be honest, if she said that to me and I was picking up the rubble, I think I'd be probably quite rude to her. I think people we're all on a journey. I didn't used to believe in climate change. I didn't disbelieve it, but it didn't make any difference to me and how I lived and what I did. And I think we're all varying stages. And I think the first stage is for people to recognize, as I said, with extreme weather events, that there's a pattern, and it's a pattern they need to be ready for. There's a pattern that there's going to be more things coming down the line. And I'm happy if people start at that as the first step. They don't have to take on board the whole thing yet, because I think it's
there is a time element though, and that's why I think it's a diabolical. It's like climate change is a diabolical scheme designed specifically so we won't react in time.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things about climate change which make it unfortunately very, very well designed to get around us and to be a problem for us. just as you get you get a particular virus which causes the pandemic, because it's just got the right mix of qualities. And climate change is like that. It's something which is very hard for us to deal with, as I say in my book, because it's got that mix of qualities. But
Okay.
but we're not. But if we were to say people who might otherwise be strongly opposed to action on climate change, they're on their journey, what would be great would be to get them to a place where they're not going to necessarily oppose action, even if they don't fully support it. That's the important stage. And then for people who are concerned about climate change, there's really the big area for us to go for I think, are the people on the center right who are somewhat concerned about climate change. I think that's the sweet spot. And we need to get those people to just shift enough over to the level of being more concerned about climate change that they start talking out about it with their friends and their family and in their social networks and their golf club and I don't know whatever people do in their churches, you know. Yeah. Anyway.
Very good.
Yeah. But I wouldn't. But by the way, I wouldn't be despondent if people don't make those connections. That's human nature not to make those connections. But sorry, it's hard, but it's how things are. But we can take people past the way.
So we have to go after Mitt Romney here in the U.S. I think is one of the ones that fit that target that you're talking about.
Mitt Romney. Well, I mean, who the hell would think that Mitt Romney would seem like the voice of sanity? Yeah, I mean,
well, he's supporting a climate tax, a carbon tax. Actually, it's been expressed.
Is he now? Okay, well, maybe he's flipped over. Because when he was running his campaign, he was strongly opposed. I mean, this is another thing. Also, is we have to make it safe. We have to make it safe for people on the right generally, and especially politicians on the right, to have a view which supports action on climate change.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on to Krister. Krister, welcome to the stage.
Good afternoon, and from Spain here. Thank you for this interesting subject. Very, very interesting, of course. I mean, the thing that strikes me is that we're talking about why our brains are wired to ignore climate change, and that's a valid point, of course. And here we are, engaging in talk, engaging in brain work, but this has shown itself not to work, and for us in our project here, I would just like to add to what Albert said, and Albert invited me to Clubhouse. Thank you very much, Albert. I would like to say that COVID gave us a green lining or a silver lining in that we engage in soil regeneration, and COVID forced us to engage in produce, so growing produce, vegetables. Mm-hmm. And whereas I have been fighting for the better part of the past 10 years with brain work or thinking or convincing or communicating, it was COVID that gave us the breakthrough, because all of a sudden people were eating our vegetables grown with biochar and raving about them. And we have a growing following, and people are literally going crazy about the quality of good food, the quality of real food. So, my comment and question is, what experiences are there out there where we have engaged our other senses? That's on the one hand. So how can we engage smell, taste, these different senses? That's the one thing. The other thing is, I think a lot of times we're talking about these subjects in a very large way. We're talking about climate change. If we can engage locally, local small communities, those local small communities can become viral in their own way and spread. So we're maybe aiming too high to begin with, and maybe we should start in small groups, local groups, with something that smells good, tastes good, and feels good.
Okay. George, what about using other senses and local?
I love this point. I mean the sense, I don't know if it's a sense exactly, but I think we should use is this joy of belonging. It's It's this sense of being part of a community, of having friends, of having family. And I think it's this idea that climate change and the solutions to climate change are things that can bring us together. I do a lot of focus groups. I mean, I've sat in hundreds of focus groups. And it comes through again and again when you say to people, what do you think is wrong? It's this sense of dislocation, that people don't have a place. It's about insecurity, about lack of identity. So I think, I mean, you're describing it there as well a bit. I think it's, and again, I go back to this point of saying the way that the way we effectively get people to listen to us is we start by validating who they are and saying what you are is really important and worthwhile. But yeah, I mean, there's another thing as well about just the joy of living, about simple pleasures. I think that it's really important that we have a discourse which is about gain, not loss. So it's not what we're giving up or what we're losing, it's what we're gaining. I mean, the big thing that especially you guys in the States need to gain is time. I mean, you are really some of the most pressured people on earth. And so having time, having space to be with the people you love, that's low carbon. Being able to maybe go a little bit slower, just to enjoy simple pleasures. I think there's something also in this, in the sense of mindfulness. I know mindfulness has become a bit of a kind of, a self-help book cliche, but there's something about being aware of who you are and where you are. It's really interesting through the COVID thing, like everywhere around the world, people saying the joy that they had from hearing birdsong, the sense that when the background noise settled down a bit and when they weren't rushing about the whole time, that they had more of a sense of that. So not to minimize the pain of COVID, but just to say it's interesting how much people yearn for that. And we did a little on the thing of mindfulness. I was working with some senior Buddhists in the States to see if we could develop kind of meditations that were related to carbon. And one of them was like when you were filling up your gas tank and you were smelling it. Be there in the moment. It's not just a chore. Be there in the moment and feel and smell what's happening and be a part of that. Similarly, if you're on a plane and your plane takes off, feel the engine, feel the burning, recognize what is happening. You don't necessarily have to like beat yourself up and go, I'm dirty and disgusting, because you've probably got reasons for being on that plane. I mean, I sometimes have to be on planes for my work, but be mindful, be present in the act.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Shanakya, welcome. What's your question?
Thank you, Dan. And George, this has been an amazing conversation, so thank you for being here. I have a quick question around, so we are focused on ocean pollution, especially PPE pollution and disposable masks that are entering our oceans by the billions. So I was going to go with a negative message, but I like your idea of trying to make it into a positive one where people would like to join it. So I would love to get any advice you might have on how we should talk about the PPE and disposable mask pollution that is happening right now. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. So look, it's not my subject, and I don't. So I sadly I can't give you a whole story on it, but I can tell you that the lessons from climate change transfer directly. If you say it's your fault, you will not get beyond the very narrow band of people who already completely take on board the ideology. If we tell just constantly the horror story, I mean, we need some, there's a place for bad news, but it's hard to reach wider. The one thing I can suggest you, just as a thought, is I was advising a group who were communicating with non-environmentalists about plastic. And I said, well, maybe you could try a different strategy of saying, hey, plastic's great. Rather than saying plastic's disgusting and dirty, plastic's great. But it's in the wrong place. Plastic should be, plastic's great. It does amazing things. It gives so much to our lives, but it should be, it should be here. It should be here. It should not be here. So in other words, to see it as a kind of as a category error, but it's in the wrong place. And the reason I say that is because, again, I've done a lot of work with people of conservative values, who, again, one of these groups is very important to reach on this, and they get very energized around plastic. And one of the reasons for that is because it's not where it should be. It's like they get very upset about trash and litter in the streets. Same thing. It shouldn't be there. So just going with a heavy systemic, argument about how it's capitalism and how we're all to blame and it's high consumption and so on doesn't work so well. I think there's something in there. And by the way, that message of saying that the enemy is great is a formula that I often think about when I'm thinking of messaging on stuff. So I did a lot of work in Alberta in Canada. I mean, the largest social research project on climate communications ever conducted in Canada, certainly. 500 people going through focus groups, a lot of conversations. And Alberta, as you might know, everybody in Alberta is in some way involved with the oil industry. And with the exception, and it's an important exception, of the indigenous communities who have had their own horrible struggle. But if we're talking about the settler communities, the conversation that was necessary was the one of recognizing the contribution of the oil industry to the prosperity of the province. But it came with a problem. In other words, it's saying we recognize what we've done, we recognize how much you've contributed. Now we know that things have to change. And again, it's that same thing. It's about saying, you know what, this thing here is important. I had a whole conversation with custom car enthusiasts. I went in California. I went to a custom car rally. I thought it might be fun when I was writing the book and interviewing them. I didn't use it in the book in the end, but it's very interesting. I was exploring, talking with them, the idea that cars are great, like the roar of the engine, and we can really get pleasure from that as something which now has had its day, and now we need to move on to something new. Yeah. So maybe that's not the answer for plastic, because I mean, on plastic we haven't moved on, but but there's something in that ballpark. I think the problem is that when we go out and we say this thing is dirty, or this is disgusting, or this is poisonous, or this is toxic, unless it really is toxic, I mean, some things really are. But if we do that, then already the tone from the very beginning is an oppositional argument with people, and some people just defend themselves.
Great. Thank you so much. Dan, welcome. Good to see you. What's your question for George?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. George, well, first of all, I work in Washington on policy and advocacy at the intersection of electricity and climate. But I have two quick questions. The first is I'm a big believer in using intergenerational legacy and inheritance and empathy and all that. And so I'm interested to see if you've worked with that or tested that or run into that in any of your research. The second question is regarding the new IEA report that came out last week. And going back to, you and Dan had a slight interchange here, probably about 10 minutes ago or whatever, talking about, the things that government will have to at some point force people to do and how you prepare them for that and so on. And, I find the IEA report to be remarkable in that it finally provides milestones between the promise or commitment and the actual goal. And some of those milestones are radical, and I don't even think they're being talked about enough, such as setting speed limits at, levels lower than they perhaps have ever been. There's just so much in that report. But the question is, is that the type of thing that you think from a communication standpoint we need to be talking more about, or is it too early, and will that turn people off when you give them something specific like that?
Yeah, specific like what? What would be the specific content from the from that report?
Well, I mean, in that report, it has recommendations for temperature settings, for the types of appliances that can be used. I just mentioned the speed limits and so on, and these are the ones that go directly to people as opposed to the ones for no more oil leasing and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll try and answer them quickly as best I can. Again, all you're getting from me is like just some ideas, these are not things I've worked on comprehensively. I will say probably a little bit more on this intergenerational issue. We need to be careful with that, with the intergenerational arguments. The starting point for any group has to be, what are their values? What are the key things which mark out their identity? And does this way of talking to them work? And we've also got to be very careful that we don't assume or transfer what works for us onto other audiences. Now, for me, intergenerational arguments work very well, but again, as I've said, I'm a freak. I'm very abnormal demographically, as probably most of the people on this call are, and so that doesn't necessarily, shouldn't pay any attention to that. The research suggests that actually these messages about the intergenerational arguments have mixed results. Consistently, we found, and I saw actually some recent research which again confirmed it, so it is consistent, that actually people who have kids are no more likely to be concerned about climate change than people who do not, and are somewhat, if anything, somewhat less inclined to be concerned about it. And I think this is very revealing. I think it suggests that they've got a lot else on, but I also think a bit like that thing I said about, like, you know, if you go to someone after Hurricane Sandy and you said you thought that was bad, well, you better see the big one coming down the line, but they don't want to hear you. Similarly, if you've got somebody whose life is entirely built around nurturing a safe world for their child, and you tell them, you know what, there's this really horrible thing you haven't even dealt with, but they try and shut it down. If it's something over which they don't have personal efficacy, but they don't feel they can take action on it. I think the evidence suggests that the intergenerational arguments works better with grandparents. So they're people who are closer to the end of their life, and they're people who are maybe thinking more about what they might leave or what they might pass on. Although, interestingly, again, there is no research to suggest that grandparents are significantly more engaged than people who don't have grandchildren. And as a group, older people are far less likely to be concerned about climate change or take action on it than younger people. So what I'd say is I'd say tread carefully. I think the important thing on that is not. Oh, by the way, we're also dealing with whole areas of blame here, where if you whoa boy, there's a minefield there if we cross over into this thing of people feel that they're being blamed for how they're bringing up their kids or bringing kids into a world, or anything around blame and children is a guaranteed disaster. I think the only thing I would say on that, which I think might be effective, and we haven't even touched on this, is the idea of personal communicators. So if people say, as a parent, this is how I feel, that can be effective, because you're not saying, as a parent, this is what you should feel. You're saying, this is me, this is what I feel. It's this idea of people holding what they have and their own motivations and then sharing it. And I think that can be effective. And I've seen that be very powerful in business context, actually, where senior business people have stood up on stage and they've said that. I remember we were working with climate scientists, training them to speak, and we'd always say, look, please at some point step out of the graphs and your professionalism, because you've proved that many times over. Say to people, and finally, as a parent with 2 small daughters, I care about this. And I've seen professional scientists even like put up photographs of their children, and it totally transforms the environment. But that's because they're speaking for themselves. Right? Now, in terms of your other question, I haven't yet read the report, although I've read bits about it. But I would say we underestimate people's preparedness to be told what to do. Right? we think because people are freedom and people want personal responsibility and so on that they're going to object. People will put up with an extraordinary degree of personal constraint and instruction if, and it's a big if they believe it's in the collective interest to do so. But that's the big if. So
Yeah, I
absolutely.
guess what I was asking
Yeah.
about there, and I didn't expect you to weigh in on some of those specific recommendations. I was
Right.
more to the point of, we talk a lot about telling people what the impacts will be and whether or not that's a good idea or not from a communication standpoint. How will they react to that? But if you say to someone that, well, if we don't do anything now, this is what we'll have to do later, which sounds like a slightly different message to me. What's your opinion on that?
No, people will say, well, I'll do it later then.
Okay.
Like every year I come up to the point where I meant to submit my taxes and they say, well, if you do it now, if you don't do it now, you'll have to pay a fine. And if you don't do this, and if you don't go to the dentist, your tooth is going to rot. People have an extraordinary degree to postpone things,
okay.
I'm afraid.
All right. Thanks, George. I've been up for a while, so I want to
appreciate
get
that.
back to Dan. Thanks, Dan.
A lot of rotten teeth here.
But I would say a final thing on that, which is that I did a lot of research on change that people were prepared to accept. And what's interesting is that people have domains of change. They have degrees to which they will accept change in certain areas. So in a city, for example, people are very open to the idea of electrification of transport and radical changes in the city. In their own homes, they are amazingly protective and conservative. It's why something like smart meters or kind of like guaranteed disaster, like you've got this thing on the wall which is giving information to the company or the government about what you're doing. And I think it's about recognizing and respecting those domains of saying places where you feel most secure, we're going to protect those. Places where you can accept the change, we're going to accelerate the change. And always navigating this space that people have, their insecurities. So saying, what's good, we're going to make better. And just to say again, it comes through again and again and again. Especially if I'm listening to conservatives. Conservatives say, "Oh, what the hell? Why didn't you just ban it?"
Right.
It's interesting. But they have, but to reach that point, they have to accept that it needs to be banned, and that's the bit which is missing in the puzzle. Is getting that mandate.
Working on. Mm-hmm. Thank you, and thank you, Dan. And Simon, you're welcome to the stage. What's your question for George?
Hi, George. Thank you so much for this. So I'm a zero COVID activist trying to reduce case of COVID to zero in Switzerland and in Europe. And I'm actually asking you, I'm trying to apply something you might have learned in climate change outreach to my activism. Let's see how that goes. So the problem is also the Swiss government has massively used the personal responsibility argument in COVID response. We're nearly as bad as Sweden with very bad results. So now the vaccination is going well, but I have to convince politicians very quickly. So time frame is a month, that we still need track and trace. We still need some of the state measures because they're trying to reduce them. So, but they're now pushing a very strong message of personal responsibility. So if you only had a month, so this is COVID activism, you have a month, you have 2 weeks. What is the most pertinent argument that you need both personal responsibility and you also need government action, and you still need government action like track and trace. So I know it's not your area of expertise, but imagine in climate science, you had a month. How do you shift the narrative? 1 month. Thank you very much.
Wow. I have to quickly shift gear in my brain to think about that. Okay. Well, here are some of the lessons we bring from climate change. Enabling social norming. So concentrating on communications that enables people to communicate with each other within their social group to say, this is what I'm doing. So it's not the personal responsibility that the government says, hey, you person over there, this is what you do. It's about people saying to each other within their social group. And I think that's essential. And that's one of the things that we've found with picking up vaccination rates for groups that are, for various reasons, skeptical. We've had some people of color in Britain distrustful of a government and they've had a low vaccine take-up. It's about enabling that peer-to-peer communication. I think it's about the quality of communicators as well. I think, if I was advising any government on COVID, I'd say, for God's sake, don't you do your communication. Like, you just do the big drumbeat, you do the big stuff. But like, if you want people's lifestyle behavior change, make sure that they're hearing those messages from people they trust. And that's not going to be you. It might be community. It might be, people. It might be people within their social group. And I think, again, it's this sense of belonging. You do something, you wear your mask or you take the vaccine because that's a contribution that you make to your group, to the place you live, to the people you care about. Not an instruction that you have to do or you'll get arrested.
Uh,
Um,
I'm very
you
sorry.
know,
I think I was misunderstood. My question was misunderstood. I'm actually talking to politicians. So how do I
uh,
convince politicians in 1 month that they
right.
shouldn't wind down the government programs like track and trace too quickly, that we still need the state programs? How do you do that? That it's not all personal responsibility.
Oh, I see. Oh,
Politicians.
for the,
Yeah,
for the,
yeah. I'm talking to politicians. It's very nasty, but that's my job. Yeah. Do you
yeah,
have any? So, what's the best argument to convince politicians and government executives, like civil servants, that we still need these track and trace programs? So, it'd be like
yeah,
that the government
yeah.
still needs to intervene. So, it's the same in climate change, that we still need the governments, or we still need, education. That's another big thing. People need to be educated about airborne transmission, which
Yeah.
is the same as
I,
climate change education.
I can't give you a full story there. I think obviously for a politician, they're balancing their fear of the political the political fear of continuing against the political fear of getting it wrong. I think that the only thing which has ever shifted anything in my own politics here in the UK has been governments realizing that if they don't do something, it's going to be an even bigger mess, and a bigger mess for them. I think there has to be an argument of saying, look, if this is something, look, if you can, I guess it's a balance of it's a cost benefit analysis. It's like, if you get this wrong and you continue protective measures a bit too long, the consequences of that for you and for your reputation, your political career, are a lot less than the consequences of ending it too soon. But actually, the political logic favors caution on this. But I think it's also about showing public support. I go back to the point I made before. It's about making support visible. On climate change, the reason that politicians, especially on the right, are reluctant to take action on climate change is because they don't see the visible evidence of support for action. They see the visible evidence of opposition to action, or they're lobbied by the oil companies or whoever don't want the action. And I think it's a similar thing. I think what I would be doing, actually, if I was trying to get politicians to do this, is I'd be doing a really clever campaign of getting people going to them and saying, I want you to continue with this. I want you to be really, really careful, and trying to find a way of creating the space for them, as it were, the cover, again, that thing, the cover, where they can hold with it. I also think it's worth pointing out that politicians around the world who have made hard political decisions have been rewarded by their electorates. You can look at Jacinta Ardern in New Zealand, who's done staggeringly well on the back of this. Politicians around the world who have taken a strong position that was not popular, but was seen to be strong. Leadership, this goes for climate change as well. People reward leadership even when they don't agree with it. That's an interesting political phenomenon. But even if you're not sure, even if you don't think that what people are doing is right, but a politician says, I think this is right, and damn it, I'm going to put myself on the line, I'm going to stick with it, do well from it. We think of sorry, I was going to mention an example, but I can't remember the politician's name. So, politicians need to feel that if they take a strong position, they will be rewarded, and I think that is the case. Anyway, I think we're up
Okay.
at time, aren't we, Dan?
Yeah,
That was
yeah.
super helpful.
Yeah, I think George. There are two more folks for questions, but if you have to go, I understand because we really went
Well,
way over
let's
the
do them
time.
quickly. Let's just do them.
Okay,
I'll
Kimberly,
do a
what's your
minute on
quick
each.
question? Your quick
Sure.
question for George, Kimberly.
Hello, thank you.
You're
Just
welcome.
quickly, I appreciate everything that you've said, but one of my questions is how do you prevent people from being so overwhelmed that they just stop thinking about it and completely shut down? Because I think that now we're at a point where a lot of people agree that there is a climate emergency or a climate crisis. And the problem is that when you think about a climate crisis, like your adrenaline goes crazy and you go into fight or flight. But the solutions to climate change don't require a fight or flight solution. And so that's why people stop thinking about it. And like, how do you get around that difficult?
I'm drawing on what I've said before. I think it's very true. I think there's a risk in that. I think, of course, it gets worse the longer we leave it. There will be a point at which climate change becomes so awful that people really don't want to deal with it. I'm personally worried that climate change is developing at a very time that the technologies for personal distraction become ever more powerful. I have a nasty feeling that one future scenario is people just lock themselves into their virtual reality headsets and just disappear into an alternative world. Um, but I think that I think first of all it's by avoiding the kind of the overwhelming doom and gloom. That doesn't mean it's like it's positive, but it means it has to be balanced. I think I would remove all of the narratives about saying that we're going to wipe ourselves off the planet. For one thing, because I don't think they're true, but also uh, I'd say this is going to be hard. Interestingly, by the way, language saying this is going to be hard, but we can get through it. Language which is grounded in a sense of pride in who you are performs very well in every country we've tried it. So I think we do. I think you say it's going to be hard. But, and this is a really important thing, you ground the language in a sense of who people are. You say it's going to be hard, but you know what? We can do it. We can really do this. We can stick with this. We can get through this because that's who we are. And whoever you're speaking to, you try and fill in the gap. That's who we are. We're going to pull together. This is our plan. This is our action. I think you've got to show people some kind of a plan as well. And maybe it's going to be hard. Like we've got to take on the politicians. You know, we've got a struggle on our hands. And I've been in a lot of protest movements where people have been overwhelmed with horrible, horrible things we've been struggling with. And the thing which keeps us going is our sense of identity with the struggle. So isolation is the deadly thing. I think bringing people together in a sense of community of combined action and a sense of pride of who they are, I think that's a powerful place to be.
That's great. Thank you. And Michael, you have the last question. What's your question for George?
Okay, I have a last question and a quick comment. So the question is, what's next? And the comment is, first of all, that I really appreciate this conversation, Dan and George. Dan, I follow you regularly and enjoyed last night your conversation as well. Given what was said, George, that you said that the governments aren't very dependable. I'm in Canada, and I know how our government is failing the climate and not achieving our goals, not achieving our sustainability goals. So my question then of what's next is what happens when sustainability fails. I'm Michael, and I really appreciate all of you.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah. What can I say? I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, what historically we're in this very strange halfway space at the moment, a kind of a limbo, where we're not yet confronted with the full realities of our inaction. What part of I'll say part of what leads me to do what I do now, and part of especially what leads me to have this story which I tell over and over about how we have to reach out, we have to embrace people who are not part of natural community, and we have to overcome polarization, which is toxic, is because I think what happens next is determined by the foundations we lay now. So if what we do is we go into the situation now of saying, this is hard, this is tough, we have a lot of differences, but we all have something to contribute, we can all pull together. but that is the dominant narrative. And when we hit the crunch, we're at least in the place where we can start talking about facing it together. My worry is that if we have supercharged polarization when we go into that we go into something really, really ugly, where we lose the chance of actually pulling ourselves through, but also we go into some kind of bitter divisions. Also, incidentally, probably divisions I'm always worried about the potential impact of extreme climate change, both impact and mitigation on our freedoms and democracies. I think I can imagine an alternative reality where we have and actually for all I know, one coming down the line where actually we have a sort of we have a climate fascist government where people become so freaked out and so concerned that they vote in something extreme. Or that we have a kind of a scapegoating. There's lots of horrible things we've done in history where when we have a really ugly situation, we just go and blame someone, we start a war, or who knows what will happen. So I think that the answer for all of that is we don't know what's going to come later on, but I think what we do right now is we lay the foundations which are built on large-scale spreading of a narrative, which is one of collaborative care through a sense of our combined humanity and our sense of pride and place, which has a space for everybody. And then, as I said, when it comes down the line, then at least we're prepared to face it together.
Thank
that's
you,
a
sir.
very, very appropriate way to end it. George, I want to thank you so much for spending extra time with us today. Man, it was all wonderful, and I think we only covered half of what we should. So maybe we'll do this again sometime. But thank you so much for all the work you've done. Thank you for inspiring me way, way long ago to communicate more effectively about climate over the years. And thank you for all the work you're doing now and the project you're doing to get government engaged. It's funny, it seems like such a huge gap that I think a lot of people just didn't notice it was this huge gap sitting there. And thank you for taking that on and let us know how we can help you.
Totally, I will. I'll be reaching out. We'll be reaching out quite widely as we go through into this year to get broad-based support from as wide as we can of people saying, start the conversation. That's what it's about. Like, start it. Let's talk about it. And let's have the resources to do it. That's the other thing. Like, nothing comes free. We talk as best we can with the people we know and the people around us, but there's a whole world of people out there we don't know. So help them to talk about it. Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I'll share with all of you and the people on the call.
Keep it up, and I think this was a great learning experience. Every time I listen to George, I learn more about how to communicate, because when you're like a room like us of people concerned about climate, we have a certain way of thinking about it where we accept the dangers, and yet it's hard to think how other people think. And he taught us a lot of things today about how to communicate better. And one of the things, which is the call to action in my TEDx talk, is talk to everybody you know. And that's one of the things he reiterated. We have to communicate about climate to everyone and do it in a respectful way.
This concludes our interview with George Marshall. You can reach George Marshall's climate outreach organization at climateoutreach.org. And you can find other Climate Chat Club interviews by searching for Climate Chat Club on YouTube. Thank you.